Today marks International Migrants Day, and it comes almost exactly 70 years after the establishment of the organization that in 1989 was renamed the International Organization for Migration. The movement of people, either voluntarily or forced, has been determined over time by a broad range of factors, including increased magnitude and frequency of disasters, economic challenges, as well as extreme poverty or conflict. At a time that COVID-19 has had an impact on every aspect of human life, migration too has been affected. And with this in mind, the theme for International Migrants Day 2021 is harnessing the potential of human mobility. I caught up with the IOM's Regional Director for Southern Africa, Charles Kwenin. Mr. Charles Quinn, the Regional Director, Southern Africa for the IOM, thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Peter, for hosting me.
So, Mr. Quinn, the IOM turning 70, what would you say the organization has been able to do over the decades?
Thank you, Peter. Indeed, the International Organization for Migration, IOM, as it is now known, has come of age at 70 years this year. But to talk about what the organization has been able to achieve over the years, perhaps allow me to take a step back to see where we're coming from in order to be able to assess how far we've come. And just to say that IOM actually started in 1951 as the Provisional Intergovernmental Committee for the Movement of Migrants from Europe. So it was actually called PICME in 1951, out of the chaos and the displacement of Western Europe following the Second World War. So it was actually mandated to help European governments to identify resettlement countries for the estimated 11 million people uprooted by the war. So PICME actually arranged transport for about nearly 1 million people during the 1950s. So successively, its name changed from PICME to the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, ICEM, in 1952, to the Intergovernmental Committee for Migration, ICM, in the 1980s, and now the International Organization for Migration in 1989. So this reflects the organization's transition over half a century from a logistics agency to the UN Migration Agency. So from its roots as an operational logistics agency, it has broadened its scope to become the leading international organization for migration, the only organization with absolute mandate for migration, working with government and society to advance the understanding of migration issues, encourage social and economic development through migration, and also to uphold the human dignity and well-being of migrants while supporting government, migrant, civil society to maximize the benefit of migration and to reduce the negative tendencies. So this is how far we've come over the past 70 years.
What would you say are the chief migration issues in the modern day, particularly on our continent, Africa?
Well, some of the key migration issues, Peter, I must say that one, more often than not, there is a misunderstanding and a misconception about migration. It's rather ironical that as IOM turned 70, even countries that used to welcome migrants and pride themselves in being immigrant countries are no more those who are willing to welcome them, because of the negative perception about migration. But by and large, all of us are migrants. If we take the global migration stock of about 1 billion, if we look at the international migration stock of about 280 million, and internal migrants of about 750 million. So 1 in every 8 person is a migrant. So perhaps you and I may have crossed the border either internationally or administratively. And also, there seems to be a tendency for securitizing migration. That is, migration is being seen by many governments as a security issue instead of a development enabler. So these are some of the issues that we really have to address, because if we see migration as a problem rather than the human reality, then we have a challenge. And these are some of the issues that confront us. That is politicizing migration instead of seeing it as a human reality and a development enabler rather than a security issue or rather than a problem to be solved.
Well, let's talk about one of those sensitivities. Xenophobia is something that we've seen quite a bit developing in various parts of the continent, actually. And I just wonder, how do we deal with something like that?
Yes, indeed, xenophobia is a real challenge when it comes to the migration discourse. And more often than not, it stems from the misunderstanding and lack of data, empirical data, because a lot of the things we hear on the social media, on the news, the newspapers, are all anecdotal. So one of the ways to address this is to provide empirical evidence to tell us the facts, what the facts really are. And that is why for IOM in the Southern Africa region, we shall be commissioning the first Southern Africa migration report. We're calling it Demystifying the Myths about Migrants and International Migration. And secondly, it's also important that we get the narrative right, because the xenophobia, as we see, often stems from poverty. That is where blighted people or areas feel that the limited resources available to them are being encroached upon by migrants. So you hardly find xenophobic attacks in middle or upper income areas. It's normally in the poor areas. So risk communication, awareness campaign, providing data to give the true picture. And also, more importantly, it's to recognize the contribution of migrants, because if you see migrants as parasite, then it becomes a challenge. But if we look at it from the positive side about the contribution of migrants, then in that case, I think there will be a different picture and look at migrants positively rather than negatively. And also let me underline the fact that xenophobia happens in many countries, and it's so unfortunate that more often than not, certain countries are perceived to be the focus or target of xenophobic attacks. But wherever it happens, it has to be condemned, irrespective of where they occur.
In fact, this leads me to the next question that I was going to ask you about this positive side of migration. If you've traveled the world, you go to a place like London, New York, and you see that these are some of the biggest cities, financial hubs, economic hubs, business hubs, whatever you want to call them. And what is common to these enormous economic centers is the fact that there are people from all over the world there contributing.
Yes, indeed, migration or international migration is a global phenomenon. And it's important that we recognize the contribution of migrants, because migration, as we've known it, has been used as a coping strategy. People moving across borders, administrative borders, in search of opportunities. But we should recognize the contribution that they make. And it's also important for us, both government, civil society, policymakers, to understand and appreciate the fact that migration is inevitable. We cannot stop it. It is desirable and it is beneficial, depending on how you manage it. So IOM has been working with governments to provide policies, both European countries, African governments, globally, because as I mentioned earlier, IOM is the UN agency for migration, helping government to address both policy and operational challenges of migration. When you look at immigrant countries like America, it's diversity, migrants that make America what it is. We look at England or UK, it's migrants. Look at their football teams. Look at their, the various areas that migrants contribute, even from heads of state, parliamentarians, policymakers, ministers. So there is a significant contribution by migrants that we all have to work together and advocate for the recognition of the right of migrants and to address the negative tendencies and the misconceptions and misperceptions about migrants.
Let's talk a little bit about the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly and Regular Migration, GCM in Africa. What role does this play, and has it been fully implemented?
Yes. The GCM, or the Global Compact for Migration, which was adopted in 2018 in Marrakesh, is the first comprehensive UN framework adopted through an intergovernmental negotiations to enhance, international cooperation on global migration governance, for that matter, because we have many people on the move, and migration is seen as, a sovereign issue. But having the GCM brings us together as a global community to have a common understanding, committing ourselves to some common principles to address migration, respecting the rights of migrants. So in Africa, we've been supporting various governments to establish national committees. And as you may know, the IOM is the UN, is the coordinator and the secretariat of the UN Network on Migration. And I must say that in the Southern Africa region, I happen to be the chair of the UN Regional Network on Migration, helping governments to achieve the 23 objectives of the Global Compact on Migration, working with other UN agencies such as UNHCR to also implement the Global Compact on Refugees, including the fair and ethical recruitment and safeguarding the conditions to ensure decent work, engaging the diaspora to promote and contribute to their home countries and host countries, and also international partnerships, so that at least both developing countries, advanced countries, countries of origin, transit, and destination can work together to achieve the objectives of the Global Compact, and therefore eventually achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
18 December is International Migrants Day. Talk to us about the importance of this day and this year's theme.
Yes, Peter, as you may know, there are so many international days. International Day of the Child, International Women's Day. In fact, the 18th is also the International Human Solidarity Day. There are so many days. So the International Migrants Day, which usually annually falls on the 18th of December, is in recognition of the contribution of migrants and to provide better understanding of migrants and migration, for that matter. This year's theme, human mobility, people on the move, has been chosen because of what confronts us globally. That is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has actually impacted on every place and every society. But more importantly, on people on the move, or people who were caught up during this whole pandemic, who were caught and stranded in various locations. So it's important that we recognize the contribution of migrants, because we cannot indeed leave migrants behind, because no one is safe until everyone is safe, and no country is safe until every country is safe. And that is why we chose this topic, so that even as governments embark on vaccination campaigns, migrants should not be left behind, because they are left behind and your nationals are not safe. And I must say that we've also chosen this theme because during all these COVID restrictions, like in South Africa level 5, where there was limited mobility, human mobility and migration, if I pose the question, so who were those who were bringing the food, the fruits, the vegetables from the market, from the fields, from the farms to the supermarkets? The supply chain mostly were the migrants. So we think it's important to recognize the contribution of migrants and their families, and also the human rights of migrants. And that is why we've chosen this theme, so that as people move, we should recognize their contribution and not as the negative tendencies that we normally tend to think about migrants. And another point that I would like to highlight is the fact that people on the move are actually part of the solution, because they are the front line providing healthcare. They are also providing services and keeping our global food production chain. And we have to recognize that. And the restrictions on mobility on borders is actually contributing to more irregular migration. So even though we are advocating for safe, orderly, and regular migration, we should also be mindful, as we take measures to curb the spread of the virus, the other implication that the more we put restrictions on the borders and human mobility, the more we also encourage irregular migration across irregular pathways, and also fueling human trafficking and smuggling, because many more migrants have become vulnerable as a result of losing their jobs. So they also become gullible to promises of jobs.
Mr. Charles Kwenin, the International Organization for Migration's Regional Director for Southern Africa, thank you very, very much indeed for your time.